one of our panelists, Max Price in South Africa, was unable to fly here to be with us today, but he has recorded his presentation, which we will see, and he will join us live via video feed from Cape Town during the question and answer. And so we're still taking the cards for question and answer. Our moderator for this panel is Alejandro de la Fuente, and he is the Robert Woods Bliss Professor of Latin American History and Economics and Professor of African American Studies and History at Harvard. He's also the director of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute and the co-chair of the Cuban Studies program at Harvard. Alejandro.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Evelyn. And thank you all for staying for a Friday afternoon, a beautiful Friday afternoon, in fact. I want to take a second to say thank you to the faculty organizers of this magnificent conference, and thank you to Dean Cohen and her staff for hosting this event. I am particularly pleased to be here and to be part of this panel on universities and slavery globally, because as a scholar of race and slavery in Latin America, I very much hope that this conference and that these conversations will resonate in the region. Of course, connections between universities or institutions of higher learning and slavery are not just a US phenomenon. We heard actually a lot about that in the previous panel. And by the time Harvard was created, a dozen universities already existed in the Americas, starting with the first of them, the Universidad Santo Tomás de Aquino in Hispaniola in 1538. And each of these institutions, Santo Domingo, Quito, Lima, Mexico, La Paz, all of them were built by African slaves. Yet this conversation has not really begun in Latin America. And that to me is by itself a very interesting question. In fact, if you do a search in Spanish, universidades y esclavitud, universities and slavery, you will get a few hits. But they speak about Brown University. They speak about Yale University. They speak about Georgetown, not about Santo Domingo or Havana. I'm also pleased to see this panel because Harvard's own relationship with slavery, of course, lasted much longer than 1783, as the previous panel also made very clear. And I was thinking about the paper about Soledad, about the Cuban plantation. And you know, being Cuban myself, we all know that Soledad was operated by slaves. And we also know that the botanical garden was somehow linked to Harvard. That knowledge exists. But there is a big difference between knowledge and acknowledgement, right? The knowledge is there, but somehow the urgent questions that we are trying to deal with here are not felt in some of these places. To lead us into this conversation, we are joined by three distinguished panelists. We will start with Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, Max Price. As Evelyn said, Professor Price could not be here with us today, but we do have a recorded presentation, and he will be joining us via a live feed from South Africa, if technology helps. We are also joined here, and I am honored to have met Congresswoman and former Minister of Justice, Madame Christiane Taubira. And we are also joined here by Vice-Chancellor of the University of West Indies, a renowned scholar of slavery in the Caribbean, Sir Hilary Beckles. And we will start with the presentation of Vice-Chancellor Max Price.
Good afternoon. It's a privilege to have been invited to participate in this panel on slavery and universities. I apologize that I can't be with you. It's our first week of the academic year, and as Vice-Chancellor, I needed to be here at the University of Cape Town. Let me start by saying that while South Africa has a history of slavery, it was abolished when slavery was abolished across the British Empire in 1834, and the universities in South Africa were almost all established long after that. The University of Cape Town was started as a college in 1929, but in truth, there is very little direct link with slavery. The only link currently is that as part of some renovations that we did on the campus, we uncovered a slave graveyard from the 18th century, and we have built a memorial to the slaves, partly as a way of recognizing people who used to live on this land before it became the university, and partly, and most importantly, as an educational tool for students today to learn more about the history. Given that limited impact of slavery on the University of Cape Town, you might well ask, as I did of President Faust when she invited me to participate in this colloquium, why it was thought I would have something to contribute, or why the University of Cape Town might have something to contribute. I presume it is because of the parallel and analogous events and student movements that have forced us to take a hard look at how the university was built upon and embodied the values not of slavery, but of colonialism and apartheid. Those protests have forced us to assess the extent to which the institutional culture today still reflects and reproduces those colonial values, and to confront how that environment today offends and alienates the descendants of those who were oppressed, disenfranchised, and excluded. But yet today, those descendants are present on our campus. Not only are they present, they actually form the majority of the students on our campus. These student-led protests started at UCT with the campaign to remove the iconic statue of Cecil John Rhodes. This campaign started off similar campaigns on other campuses across the country and, in fact, around the world. The so-called #RhodesMustFall campaign, in some senses, led this battle charge. Rhodes was the perfect symbol of this problem. A supreme colonialist, he was on the one hand a generous benefactor, having gifted to the nation the land on which the university is now built, and of course many other commitments, financial commitments to education of future generations. He was also a remarkable businessman, a diplomat, a politician, and ultimately the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. Yet on the other hand, he was responsible for conquering and annexing land for the empire, was ultimately responsible for military massacres, particularly in what is now Zimbabwe, exploited labor on the mines through the manipulative use of legislation which forced people off the land into the cash economy, and perhaps most importantly, removed the vote from many black people in the Cape Colony who previously had the right to vote. Partly because the university is built on the land he gifted, he was nevertheless honored in the 1930s with a large brooding bronze statue positioned in the central focal point of the architecture of the campus. No other significant statues of individuals exist on the campus. Thus it would seem that UCT was honoring Rhodes, presenting him as a role model and someone who embodies the values of UCT. While for many students, if they cared to know something about Rhodes and the history, the statue represented the victory over the colonized masses, revering a man who had deprived their ancestors of numerous different rights to land, to the vote, and even to life. Although the statue was never intended to be a tool of exclusion, that's what it had become. The campus could not be considered inclusive while it stood in its prominent position. After a month of consultation and debate, in 2015, the Senate and the Council, which is the governing body of the university, agreed that it should be removed. But it was not only about the statue. Far from it. The statue symbolized the colonial culture that through the statue, the university continued to valorize. The university does indeed have its roots in the colonial era and is modeled on the Oxbridge models of universities. You look at the architecture of UCT, of the university, and it tells you something about what the university aspires to be. If you walk through the passages of the departments of the university, the walls are lined by portraits and photographs of previous heads of departments, professors, and deans, almost all of whom, not surprisingly, are white males. The buildings and rooms of the university are mostly named after white males, some of whom were academics, some of whom were benefactors, and some of whom were political leaders from the colonial period. In the curricula, there is often little or no recognition of thought leadership that comes from societies other than Western civilization, or that other civilizations have contributed to some of the collective canon that is what we today consider the sum of human knowledge. The curriculum often rejects or refuses to recognize the validity of other belief systems. Say, for example, in health sciences, belief systems about the role that ancestors play in one's health. The message that students construct about the attitudes and values of the university is derived, therefore, from what is reflected back to them, back from the walls, back from the curricula, back from the role models they have as lecturers and professors. What is reflected back to them as examples of excellence, as examples of the culture of the institution, and what is reflected is a white culture. And so for black students, there is a pervasive sense of alienation. And it is exacerbated by many other experiences, such as how people, both black and white, respond to other black people based on the stereotype assumptions that they have internalized, based on cues such as color, accent, dress, and much more. The choice of artworks and sculptures on display in public places is another source of alienation. Some students come from cultures where nudity, especially of older people, is considered so disrespectful towards older people that they will not bring their children to see their workplace because they do not want to have to explain why such nudity is on display. And then they challenge us with the question, how is this an inclusive campus if I cannot bring my children to work? Artworks that were created, say, 40 years ago during the apartheid period, depicting the wretchedness of black life under apartheid. Often these were courageous political statements at the time, some of the works by black artists and photographers, but these today, ironically, may be regarded out of context as simply a further repetition of the black person's typical and even expected station in life. There are no whites depicted this way in these artworks and photographs. So the young black student, born post-apartheid, does not see this as an anti-apartheid statement. She sees this as a statement about the university and how the university and how white people view black people as an underclass. These are the issues that have been dominant on our campus over the last 2 years, in the equivalent of what in the US are the Black Lives Matter campaigns, which here tend to take the form of arguments about coloniality and decolonization. And these are the issues that we have needed to address. So what have we done? We have initiated a number of interventions to begin to address the concrete elements of the environment that are signaling this exclusive colonial culture. Transformation is therefore no longer primarily about racial demography, though that remains an unfulfilled challenge, especially in the level of faculty. Now transformation is about changing the institutional culture. It is also more than just recognizing and representing the different heritages of those who now constitute the new university community, such as through naming buildings after struggle heroes or in indigenous languages. It is more about removing and changing the names of buildings that honor people who were oppressors, even if they may only be regarded that way in the light of today's value systems. It is about reviewing artworks that cause offense and either contextualizing them adequately, if possible, or placing them in galleries rather than in public places where people can choose to view them or not. It is about rethinking the pageantry of ceremonies, such as graduation or commencements, to reflect less colonial traditions and incorporate local traditions and music. Perhaps the hardest intervention is engaging with the challenges of what some consider epistemic violence, quote unquote. The nature of knowledge and pedagogy in higher education. This may refer to curricular content, such as including intellectual contributions from non-Western and especially African thinkers, to teaching about indigenous belief systems as part of core curricula in some professions, to ways of learning and teaching. The extent of such curriculum decolonization will vary by discipline and profession, and much of this is still notional and unformed. It cannot be imposed on academics. They have to be persuaded to take up the challenge, to listen seriously to the concerns of those who feel marginalized and who feel that the curriculum does not speak to them, and to seek out these problems and find ways of addressing them. At core in transformation, therefore, is a change in attitude to what is meant by inclusiveness. Previously, we meant by inclusiveness helping newcomers adapt to and succeed in the institution as it is, with its historic culture. This entailed removing barriers, affirmative action, academic support, bridging programs, acculturation, writing skills, essentially becoming more like us, more like the historically dominant group. The newcomer was expected to fit in, to assimilate, and we would do everything to assist that. Post Rhodes Must Fall, inclusiveness means changing the culture of the institution too, to reflect the different cultures and heritages and values of those who constitute its community. It is actually a change in our identity as an institution. Thank you very much.
Good evening, good afternoon to each of you. I'd like to spend a few seconds to tell you how pleased I'm being here with you at the critical time of the world life, so critical time. I'd like to thank Mrs. President, Mrs. Drew Gilpin-Faust, and Mrs. Dean, Elizabeth Cohen, for this invitation, because it's very important for me to share with you our thoughts, our works, our prospects about such a sensitive matter as slavery and universities. That means slavery and knowledge, slavery and ethical matters. At this very beginning of the statement, I think it's important for me to make clear 2 points. First of this point, because I'm going to speak about the French experience. First of this point is that during the time where France was involved in slave trade and slavery, this slavery was not practiced on its own territory. You know what was the so-called triangular trade? You know the facts. It was a very lucrative activity. The facts are that boats leaving European harbor, carrying different kind of goods, reaching the African coast, and then dealers could buy these women, these men, these children who were captured in the villages, in the cities, all over the African continent. And then these boats cross what became huge, deep cemetery, the Atlantic Ocean. Where are your monuments, your battles, martyrs? Where is your tribal memory? Sirs, in that grey vault, the sea. The sea has locked them up. The sea is history. That's a part of a poem of Derek Walcott, the St. Lucian Caribbean poet. The sea is history. And so, once arrived in the Americas and the Caribbean islands, the same boats unloaded from and chained people. These people were driven to the slave market to be sold again. And the same boats were loaded with sugar, coffee, cocoa, gold, silver, spices, tobacco, and so forth, and they sailed back to Europe. That was this triangular trade. And it was the way it worked during 4 centuries as a whole. I said to you that it's a very important point to understand that slavery was not practiced on the own territory of France. So, for French people, slave trade and slavery is something very far. It's just trade. It's something colonial. Unless for philosophers, writers, some workers, some citizens too, who protested against it. They protested during the time of slave trade and slavery. But it was far, and in the French collective consciousness, slave trade is something far, far, far. Slavery is kind of colonial matter, even maybe a private one, although there were public companies settled and managed by the power state. So during this hard and very dark period, when slave trade and slavery were practiced, there was not a massive physical presence in France, so there was not massive confrontation. It's a very important point. The second important point is that France is not a federal country like the United States of America. France is a centralized country. That means that political or legal decision applies on the spot and all over the territory. So when the French Parliament voted the law that settled that slave trade and slavery is a crime against humanity, the law applies on the spot all over the territory. It took 2 years for the bill I wrote to become a law, arguing with the House of Representatives and the Senate. This law contains a solemn and official proclamation that slave trade and slavery is a crime against humanity. That slave trade was not a trade. It was a crime, and not any kind of crime, a crime against humanity. That means the enslaved people were not slaves. They were not goods. They were not materials. They were not furnitures. They are women, men, children, human beings. That's what this proclamation means. Other provisions of this law deserve to be mentioned. According to Article 2, the state is compelled to organize the teaching of this history in all public schools, from primary till university. You know, in France, more than 80% of the schools are public schools. And the state is compelled to encourage, facilitate, support, including financially, research, cooperation between universities and other institutions in the country and abroad. Article 3 founded a National Committee for Memory and History of Slavery. This committee has on charge all kinds of actions likely to make this story well known, better known in the whole country. And this committee, up to now, gives every year a prize, an award of 7,000 euros for a high-level work of a student. Every year there is another prize for scholars, that means children and teenagers, called the Flame of Equality. Every year, too, they organize a big civic meeting. They have in charge to organize seminars and symposium, to lead relationship with UNESCO and others. And last year, for instance, 150 events were organized all over the territory. I must say that there was an article in the bill relevant to reparation. After months and months of polemics, this article was removed. But the debate is still there. The following article sets up a date, a national date, for an official and solemn ceremony. This ceremony is shared by the French President of the Republic. It takes place in the heart of Paris, in the Jardin de Luxembourg. And last year, the guest of honor was the Reverend Jesse Jackson. And in the whole territory, there are ceremonies, local ceremonies, organized by the prefects. The prefects are high public servants representing the state all over the territory. We have different situations. For instance, in Bordeaux, it's also in 2009 that the first local ceremony took place. I must remember that 2 years debating the law, the bill before law. The National Committee was set up only on 2004. The first national ceremony, official, took place only on 2006, and the first local ceremony in Bordeaux in 2009. But we have also counter-examples, such as Nantes. Nantes is a big city that tackled with this story since many years. In 1985, for instance, Nantes organized, when I say Nantes, I speak of association and the city hall. They organized an event remembering the 3rd century of the Black Code. The Black Code stipulated that slave and slave people were furnitures. In 1992, Nantes organized an event, Les Anneaux de la Mémoire, Julien Bonders talked about them, Les Anneaux de la Mémoire, remembering the 5th century of Christopher Columbus' journey in West Indies. And in 2012, Nantes opened this wonderful, beautiful, very powerful memorial, very important in the city. So we have this counter-example. Anyway, we observe that we face pushbacks. That means, so between historians, But mainly I talked about Bordeaux, that is a big, great city, nice city. That was the second important harbor, French harbor, during slave trade. Nantes was the first one. And people pay attention to the sociology of the city. I mean, we see that professors, teachers are very, very careful not to upset the families whose fortune comes from slave trade. So it's a real break against facing this history. But we try to deal with that. And even if we are facing these pushbacks, we keep working on it, and more people are involved in this truth of this story and the way this history has shaped the society and the mentality. So this example shows that when at the level of the state of a country, the courageous decision is taken to recognize a crime against humanity and to take all the consequences of this recognition, it's a way to drive the whole society to tackle, to grapple this history, and to include it in the day-to-day life. So I will conclude considering all these elements. I remember some words of James Baldwin. James Baldwin was criticizing what the President JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, said. It was in 1962. He said, it's quite conceivable that in the United States, within 40 years, there will be a black president. And James Baldwin said, for people living at the present, this far prospect is unacceptable. I'm concluding. Is unacceptable. And he was right. And however, the fact is that you had a black president more than 40 years later. And 8 years after the power of this black president, excuse me, but what a backlash. What a backlash. Anyway, this helps us to understand that opposition is not amazing. It's not amazing at all. We just have to remember that it's about people, so we are not allowed to give up. We must stand up, because it's about people. It's about broken personal destinies. It's just for money. It's about people living today, people hearing, hey, nigger, hey, bambula, hey, boy. It's about people who are shot with no reason, but it's about the children, boys, girls, who are not allowed to go to school. We are working in the plantations. We are working in the house, in the master's house, serving the master, the mistress, the children of the master, of the mistress. It's about these people. Some other people think they have no predestination to go to university or to win Nobel Prize. It's about children who have no right of childhood. So we can't give up. We just can't give up. We have to stand up for that. In a poem, Langston Hughes, the title is I Too Sing America. Some say that it was an answer or response of Walt Whitman's poem. He says, I am the darker brother. They send me to the kitchen when company comes. And I laugh, and I eat well, and I grow strong. I too sing America. Maybe he's right. Maybe we are the darker brothers, the darker sisters, but we are. We just are. We are. That's what. This is not about race. It's not a racial topic. It's not a racial matter. It's a human one. It's a social one. It's an ethical one. Because we are all created equal. Thank you. It was a fact.
Madam President, colleagues, and friends, good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor to be a part of this discourse, this conversation, and to speak from the perspective of the Caribbean and to give voice to my identity as the Vice-Chancellor of the only regional university in the Caribbean, the University of the West Indies, which, as you know, has 3 landed campuses in Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and university centers scattered all across the region. A university that has been a part of this epic Caribbean struggle against slavery and colonization, a part of this enlightenment journey of Caribbean peoples who have been very intolerant and rebellious within the context of this history, whether from the traditions of marronage that covered the entire region through to the Haitian Revolution, where the people of the Caribbean were the first in this hemisphere to uproot slavery, remove it, and criminalize it, through to all of the other revolutionary struggles in the Caribbean for justice and for democracy. This university I lead is a part of this history. It originated in the workers' revolution of the 1930s, where the people stood up against British colonization, demanded an end to the colonial regime, and stood up for democracy, for social justice. The British government responded to this by establishing a university college, which originated as a college of the University of London in 1948. So that is the nature of the university's origin. But by 1963, we had decolonized that relationship and declared an independent University of the West Indies, independent of the University of London. The journey, of course, is not over. There are still colonial relationships in the Caribbean. There are still colonies of France. There are colonies of America, colonies of England, The majority of our societies, yes, have been decolonized, but there are still some outstanding communities across the archipelago that are still trapped in the colonial relationship. And everywhere, the legacy of slavery is not only immediate, but very aggressive in its agency. And so for us, the entire environment, the ecology of our existence is surrounded by these institutions rooted in slavery, built by slave owners. Whether they are physical structures, ideological structures, we are still surrounded by it. And for us, slavery is not remote. It is immediate, it is pressing. There are still people in our region whose great-grandparents were born in a slavery circumstance. But our campuses are located in the most beautiful environments. This is an image, a Google map of the campus in Barbados. As you can see, it's a beautiful campus overlooking the ocean, but surrounding a cricket field, which is the quintessential British model of building a campus with a cricket field at its core. That is a model derived from the classical British tradition. That is an image of the Barbados campus at Cave Hill, where I had the pleasure to be the provost there for 15 years. This is an image of the Jamaica campus, the Mona campus, the long, beautiful Queensway leading into the heartland of the campus with the magnificent Blue Mountains of Jamaica in the background. But it's important to realize, though, that these beautiful environments, these really wonderful, charming, and picturesque communities, all of these campuses are built on lands that were slave plantations. Here at Mona, the beautiful Mona campus, this was the lands occupied by the Mona sugar plantation, where hundreds of enslaved peoples toiled and were buried. We have the list of all of those enslaved persons who were emancipated with the British Act in 1833. We have excellent documents of all of these people who were the last among the enslaved on the Mona estate, the land we now occupy as the Mona campus of the university. And as you can see here from these images, the vast majority of these enslaved persons were described as Creole, that is, born in Jamaica, as opposed to imported from Africa. It's a very long list, and I will not go through this. But our campus at Mona is associated also with all of the traditions of crimes against humanity that we are now treating with. The indigenous peoples who experienced genocide under the Spanish colonial project, they also lived on the land that is now the Mona campus. And here are some shacks. These were buildings that were constructed on the land that became our campus to house those Jewish refugees who were able to escape the Third Reich. And these structures were built to rehabilitate some of those Jewish people who fled through Gibraltar and found their way into the hands of the British. The British took care of them and brought them here to this land site. And there are many prominent members of the Jewish community whose parents were actually housed in these structures before the structures evolved into the university. So we have the history then on our Mona campus, not only of indigenous slavery, but also African slavery, and also indeed the Holocaust against the Jewish community. This is a structure that was designed to accommodate the Jewish refugee camp. And here you can see Jewish persons in this facility in the mid-1940s. This is an image of the campus chapel, which was built by enslaved persons first as a sugar mill. In the 18th century, this was a mill of the sugar estate, which was dismantled, and the stones were brought from the Jamaican countryside to the Mona campus and reconstructed as a chapel. So from a sugar mill, which was destructive of the lives of enslaved Africans, to a Christian chapel of reflection. These are some of the ruins that still exist on the campus, the legacies of the slave estate. But here is an interesting image. This is an image of the new medical faculty complex, which was constructed 4 years ago. It's a beautiful facility built on the campus because the university campus here started in 1948 as a medical faculty. And some 6 years later, we decided to build a state-of-the-art teaching and research complex. But while we were doing this, or while we were getting ready to do this, something extraordinary happened on the campus. The contract was allocated. A major Chinese multinational firm won the contract to build this complex. And they came on the site and were preparing to excavate the foundations to do what they had to do. And guess what? The bones began to come up from the earth. We then discovered that this facility was about to be constructed on the burial ground of the enslaved Africans. And no one knew that this was the site, the ceremonial site. This was a site where hundreds of Africans were buried in unmarked graves on the soil. Of course, we had to stop the construction. We did all of the excavations. We removed all of the bones of these ancestors. We took them out. We did what was necessary and what was appropriate. And then we constructed a memorial on the site. And there you can see Danny Glover, who was a part of that conversation. And here now we have a memorial with the names of all of the enslaved Africans that we were able to find in the records on this monument. I moved to the Barbados campus. The Barbados campus at Cave Hill, also built on a slave plantation, or a series of slave plantations. Celebrating the 50th anniversary of this campus 4 years ago, we carried out a major analysis, historical analysis, of the community that now constitutes the campus. We were able to identify all of those, or most of those enslaved Africans who worked on that land that is now the Cave Hill campus of the university. This is a major publication that sets out this history. And here is a monument on the campus, on the periphery of the campus overlooking the Caribbean Ocean. And this monument is called Quaw's Quest. Why Quaw? We discovered that in 1793, a 3-year-old child from the Congo was sold into slavery in Barbados on the auction blocks in Bridgetown and was bought by the owner of the land which we now occupy as our campus. The gentleman who bought young Quaw, he had a 3-year-old white child and he wanted a toy for his child, and so he bought Quaw. Quaw grew up on this land, and it was soon discovered that he was a remarkable and phenomenal child. And so he acquired literacy through his own efforts. And at emancipation in 1834, we discover that Quaw is now a teacher of children on the estate. The Church of England built a chapel on the land, and Quor was invited to become the sexton of the chapel, becoming the first black sexton of an Anglican church anywhere in the world. He's now a teacher, conducts Sunday school classes for the kids on the estates. In this sense, therefore, Quor becomes the first teacher. He becomes the first teacher and academic of the Cave campus. So we see him as our ancestor. He is the first to be involved in the profession of teaching. And not bad for a child who was thrown into slavery at the age of 3. His parents were killed in the raid on his village. And now we memorialize Quor on the campus. And in the background there of that symbol are plates made of fiberglass with the names of all of the enslaved persons who worked on the soil that is now the Cave Hill campus. And these are the list of all of those enslaved Africans, where they were born, whether in Africa, in Barbados, and other islands of the Caribbean, their names, their profession, their color, all of that. So we have all of these lists, males and females, children, boys and girls, and we see Quor there at emancipation. These are the huge books that carry their names so that students can leave the classroom, go to Quor's monument, and see the journey of their ancestors on that space that is now the campus. And why do we call it Quor's Quest? He died in the cholera epidemic of 1854, and while in his last hours of life, he gave his testimony to the local priest, and he said, well, I was brought here as a child without a family. Now I'm a teacher, I'm a free man, I have a wife, I have 4 children, my quest is complete. And so we call this monument Quor's Quest. But we did not end there in this process of engaging the environment and rehabilitation. We did not end there. 6 years ago, the task, it was my responsibility to construct a new administration building on the campus. I assembled a team of architects and I said, okay, we are now going to build a facility on this campus that represents the administrative function of the institution. And we thought, why not design our administration building with the architectural motif of the African golden stool, the golden stool of the Ashanti. The golden stool of the Ashanti, the first rebellion on the island of Barbados. The first attempted revolt was 1675. An Ashanti man by the name of Kofi was meant to become the king of Barbados, destroy the slave owners, destroy slavery. Kofi was going to be installed in the ceremony of state, and he would become King Kofi of Barbados in classical Ashanti fashion. They had a stool made of wood, and he was meant to be installed on the 12th of June, 1675, when the revolt had succeeded. Well, they did not succeed. Kofi was beheaded and burnt alive. He and all of his followers. And the stool they had made of wood for this ceremony was also burnt. We took the decision, the bold decision, of giving King Kofi his stool. And now Barbados, the Cave Hill campus, on a land built for slavery and plantation, now the home of the campus, King Kofi of the Asante now has his golden stool. And there we go, the golden stool of King Kofi. When this structure was completed, the vast majority of people in Barbados assumed it was a Chinese building. So detached were the citizens from their history, their Ghanaian roots, and the vast majority of the Africans on the island are from what we now call today, or what was called then the Gold Coast. The majority were Asantes, Gas, and Fantis. This would have been a common symbol for their ancestors. The ancestors would have known immediately what this represented. But the descendants do not. So detached they are from their history, so detached they are from their historical cultural roots, which is fundamentally one of the crimes of slavery, to be detached from your roots. And now the school children come to the campus on a weekly basis to receive historical lessons in their African history and culture, and to understand the significance of this structure as a proud symbol on a campus where thousands of enslaved Africans worked and died. And allow me to say in conclusion that we didn't end there with the management of the physical environment. Our teaching, our research, our public advocacy, our professional training, we engage this history every day. Our university sees itself as part of that mandate to clean up the legacies of slavery. All we do, we confront it, we engage it, we are cleaning this up, whether it's in the area of public health, diabetes, hypertension, whether it's in the issues of anti-poverty, all the issues, all the legacies of slavery. This university engages these legacies daily. This is where our resources are allocated. And we have taken one final step. 3 months ago, the University of the West Indies established the Institute for Reparations Research. This institution came in against the background of the establishment of the Caribbean Commission for Reparations. We are going to construct the evidentiary basis for the reparatory claim which will be made against all of those empowering institutions and governments of Western Europe, including, of course, the financial institutions, all of those who were criminally enriched in this process of enslavement. And so this institute is seen as a critical step towards the process of developing a social justice pedagogy within the university. And we really do hope it will be a part of a global network of similar institutions that will help us to move this conversation forward. I thank you.
So we have now live from South Africa, Vice-Chancellor Price, who will speak to us live for a few minutes. Can you hear us?
I can indeed. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and I enjoyed, let me greet you and greet Sir Hilary and Madame Taubira. Thank you all for the opportunity, and thank you, President Faust, for the opportunity. In listening, I was connected already to listen to the video of my presentation, and I thought I had understood I needed to speak only for 10 minutes. So thank you for giving me just a few more minutes. As I watched my own video, I realized that in the short time, there was a risk of oversimplifying a number of issues, and so the opportunity just gives me an opportunity to highlight some nuances that I didn't. The first was in talking about decolonization and coloniality. Of course, the key challenge is what constitutes the colonial. What constitutes the colonial in, say, artworks, which, as we know, belies the way in which contemporary artworks are the sum of influences from many heritages and many sources. And so that when one comes to grappling with what it means to decolonize an environment, that becomes, of course, hugely contested, and there aren't easy answers. I think as I presented it, it sounded a whole lot simpler than that. The second, I think, is that students do not speak with one voice. There are many different views, and certainly many different views amongst black students, and many black students who would say of artworks that the purpose of art is to move one out of one's comfort zone. So while there will be some who will feel and take offense, others will say that's what art is about. And so then who gets to decide on a campus as diverse as we are and as one would expect to find in a country like South Africa, who gets to decide then, and how does one resolve what it means to be an inclusive environment? This relates from everything: architecture, names of buildings, artworks, curricula, role models. I think with respect to some of these, one of the lessons we've learned as the debates have proceeded is that as much of it resides in the question of curation and curation policy as in the artworks themselves. And that it is often not any individual artwork that is the problem, but the sum of them and how they are presented, and often decontextualized or not sufficiently contextualized. And the final point, thank you, that I'd like to add with the extra minute offered is that in reflecting on my talk, I think, again, I was in a shorthand trying to highlight, it would have come across as a significant rupture from the pre-Rhodes Must Fall period to the post-Rhodes Must Fall period, as if prior to Rhodes Must Fall, there was no debate or no consciousness of this coloniality and no challenge of it, perhaps even a pride in a particular dominant culture. And that wouldn't be correct. Over many decades, in fact, those debates have been going on, and it's an interesting question but separate from this discussion about why this suddenly bubbled over in 2015, what the national dynamics were and the global dynamics. But there were certainly plenty of debates going on before. Perhaps the key shift was the success of transformation, that the number of black students and black faculty in the university had reached a critical mass where what was hegemonic culture could be more easily challenged, where people found their voice not only as individuals who had always found their voice, but as collectives, which surfaced the issues in very graphic and sometimes violent forms, and has resulted in the protest movements we've seen over the last 2 years. But thank you again for the opportunity to add a few comments, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Max. So we have limited time left, and I'm going to try to summarize some of the questions. We have received a few from the different audiences, including some from Twitter, which apparently can be used for good purposes. I didn't know that. And I'm going to start with a question that I think can actually be addressed by all of our panelists, and the question reads as follows. Madame Taubira spoke of how France's centralized governance made action possible. Can each of you reflect on the differences between action that comes from the top and action that begins at the grassroots? How are these forms different?
I try to answer with my English.
Your English is impeccable.
That is a light luggage. I do believe that it's very important that the citizens feel concerned by this topic, because it's about their lives, their history, our past. But let's go. Let's watch what was this past. It was public organization, states, public companies. It was a monarchian time. Maybe I must thank the Consul Général de France who is here. Maybe he will help me between French and English. I say I see that the ambassador is there too. I try to explain. Slave trade and slavery were organized by the state. It was a public activity. The societies were organized around this activity. It was a main economic activity. And moreover, there was at this time, in the European countries, there were every time wars between them, every time. The countries were not still stabilized. And all of them agreed that when they have a conflict, they call the Pope, the Vatican. No? You understand what I mean? And the Pope was the one who said, the king here and the king here who are fighting, you stop. Because I say that, I give you that, I give you that. That's what happened between Spain and Portugal when the Pope decided the Tordesillas Treaty, which divided South America, not only South America and Africa too, divided the West for the Portugal and the East for the Portugal and the West for Spain. So that's the way it was working at this time. The government, the monarchy, the Pope. So today, when we deal with this issue, we can't just do it between citizens, between associations, we need that the public power say something about it, organize a few things about it, such as teaching in the schools, in the university, and helping researchers, teachers to make research and to help us to understand, to know very well, and to understand. Not to be killed by that, but to feel stronger, to understand that we are survivors, that we are invincible. I should say that we are immortal. How do you say that in English? Immortal. Good. It's good. Generation from generation, we are immortal. That means that we grow stronger, and stronger. The next generation stronger than the former one. That's the reality of this history. So we need the implication of the states to organize that, to make it penetrating the world society. That's what I think.
Thank you. You know, 3 years ago, the governments of CARICOM agreed to confront this history not only in respect of financial institutions, academic institutions, and the legacy of slavery and colonization, but to see how they can play a role in furthering what is really a civil society discourse. Governments had been reluctant to participate in this conversation for 100 years. As I said, we're still in an age in which the colonial structures are still very much a part of the Caribbean world. My friend here, I'm from Barbados. Just 15 minutes away from Barbados by flight is Martinique. You arrive at Martinique and there's an enormous oppressive sign at the airport which says, "Welcome to France." And we find that very offensive, you know, to arrive in the neighboring island and just "Welcome to France." That is extremely horrific for us who have fought for our independence and who have established our nations Now, so there is this conversation of ongoing colonial aggression, but each time governments come on board, they do so not to initiate, they do so to join an existing conversation where public opinion has tilted in a certain direction. And in respect of confronting this history, I would say that for the better part of the 20th century, the political posture of most governments, colonial and the first generation of independent states, was let us forget the history and move on. There was this kind of pedagogy of forgetfulness. Let us put the past behind and let us move on. Civil society was saying, no, but we are living with this history every day. We need to deal with it. The governments were saying, no, let's move on. And we had this enormous rift between civil society and governments. Then suddenly the governments came on board because of a realization that you're caught in a trap. You do not want to look back and you cannot go forward. And if you cannot move forward and you don't want to go back, where are you? And therein lies this conversation that it has to be addressed. And therefore, the question of all of these institutions, not only the academic institutions, but the churches. We are living in a world in which some of the largest slave owners in the Caribbean were clergymen. In Barbados, my island, the largest slave owner in the decade of emancipation was a Reverend John Brathwaite, well-known theologian. The Church of England, in its corporate identity, was the owner of 3,000 slaves on the island. It bought and sold them in many of the same way. The slaves were stamped C of E, Church of England, and they were stamped on the back, Church of England. So these are the histories, and yes, the academic discourse is about the university and slavery, the church and slavery, the banks and slavery, the industrial corporations and slavery. All of these major institutions in our ecologies were built upon slavery and sustained by it. So the university and slavery, is a part, an element of a wider conversation, which I hope we can also get to.
Max, would you like to add something?
No, thanks. I'm going to interpret the question perhaps a little more in the context of the theme of slavery and universities. And I think one of the challenges is within a university is the idea of academic freedom and the autonomy of universities. And so one question is, what should the role of government be in relation to universities when if it wishes to memorialize or to encourage debate or to perhaps push a particular line? For example, the law that we heard passed in France that every school child should have in their curriculum knowledge of the history of slavery is certainly an example of leading from the top and imposing from the top. I think that the universities in our environment would be very reluctant to be told what they have to teach and to have a central government determine a curriculum. Now, I know that the law probably applies to the schools, not to universities. I don't know if it does apply to the universities in France. But in trying to answer your question more directly, I think that with respect to universities, the question of authority, top-down, the autonomy of universities and the issues of academic freedom raise other issues which for me are very precious, core to the values of these institutions. And so I would not want to see that kind of central authority exercised. And in fact, I think it trickles down within the institution too. And part of the challenge for all of us as university leaders is that you can't it's not easy to lead from the top in the way you might in a corporate environment or in a political environment, to say we will transform the curricula in this way, or we will decolonize in that way, or we will reflect our relationship with slavery in the other, because academics themselves value and treasure the autonomy to teach what they want to teach and who they want to teach and how they want to do that. And so I think that the role of university leadership has to be much more one of mobilizing and persuasion and cajoling and building a consensus, building a movement. Certainly, if we look at how, in our own case, the debates around the Rhodes Statue and other examples that I gave, some have not been successful because we haven't been able to build sufficient support. Some quickly caught on, and many have many of the successes have become successes because they started as grassroots activities which gathered support, found a sympathetic ear, I think, in authority in most cases, but could not have been successful if it wasn't a dialectical process.
I think I have a slightly different approach to this issue. In our university's charter, there is reference to the institution being expected to be not only excellent, but also ethical. And within this discourse of being excellent and ethical, and we have focused, generally speaking, as university administrators on the discourse about being excellent and all of the quality assurance systems we put in place, and we invest significant resources in the trajectory towards excellence. But we tend to get a bit soft, I think, around how we interpret the ethical part. Now, I believe that in respect of slavery, and colonization, apartheid, and all of these other crimes against humanity, we have exercised a very low level of expectation. And it has always been strange to me why, in respect of many of the crimes of the 20th century, for example, we showed a level of rage, and we don't show the corresponding rage in relation to slavery. I do not believe that any president or provost in this country would accept a monument of a Nazi general on their campus. I believe that if you examine the iconographic history of this country and in the first phase of nation building, all of the monuments of King George and the British generals were taken down. The Duke of Portland, the Duke of Marlborough, all of these British warmongers, all these generals were taken down from the public spaces, taken down from the public squares and from the campuses, because the nation was emerging and it was intolerant of British imperial symbols. Even the game I love, cricket, was removed from this country because Abraham Lincoln said, I have no doubt cricket is a greater game than baseball, but at last it will not serve our purposes. It is a British colonial product, it must go. Okay, so all of that took place in the first stage of nation building. Now we come to this stage and all the monuments of the slave owners are there. Why is there this tolerance? Why are we tolerating slave owners on our campuses and we don't tolerate British imperial generals on our campuses? Why do we take down King George and we cannot take down Jefferson? Why is that so? If we confront that fact and we say, okay, this is the second phase of American nation building, let us now look at how we deal with our environment. Those who say take down the monuments are not doing something for the first time. This is the second phase of monuments discussion. Very briefly. And the first phase was very effective. I think that sometimes we hide behind our prejudices and we find very skillful academic reasons to say we must not act. We must not act, we cannot act because academic freedom, blah, 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 and so on, which I respect. But the threshold is always oftentimes too low on the questions of the black history. We set a low threshold. I would not be a part of a conversation that would defend those persons who committed atrocities against the Jewish people. I would not have those monuments on my campus. I don't think my students would. Those persons who committed crimes against the African peoples by enslaving them, that is the same threshold, the same level of threshold we hold for those who committed war crimes against the Jewish people. We hold that same threshold against those who committed crimes against the African peoples. And we keep a common standard. So I do not accept this notion that people like Cecil Rhodes, who was really, in fact, effectively a genocidal maniac, really. People like Cecil Rhodes can be defended by any principal or provost that we have Cecil Rhodes on our campuses because our intellectual freedom says let him stay. I'm sure that if you apply the same threshold that you have applied to the Holocaust against the Jewish people, to the African people, you would have a different conclusion. And I say one final point on this. When the Nuremberg trials were about to commence and the judges were having tremendous difficulty in litigating this crime against the Jewish people, there was no precedent in law for these crimes. There was no jurisprudence they could use. There were no body of legal thought to guide them through this. And they were becoming a bit disillusioned. And one of them actually said, in the midst of their despair of not knowing how to proceed, we are walking into the desert, and somewhere out there is water. Let us go and find it. And with that metaphor, they moved through those trials and brought those persons to justice. Now, I believe that all of us who are leaders of university institutions, we are walking into the desert. And somewhere in that desert, there is an oasis we need to find. And I think we should brace ourselves, prepare ourselves, and walk into the desert. Thank you.
Let me move to the next question. Okay.
No, it's very important because I'm quite sorry, but yes. It's about the question of the government who says what to teach. It's not the point. I mean, what I said, what I explained about this law that compels the government to organize teaching of this history. It's not teach what the government thinks. It's putting it the agenda. And the teachers make their job. And in the same article, the government is compelled to finance research and cooperation in order to know exactly, to know this history, all these aspects of this history. So it's not a government that decides what people must know, but to stop not knowing anything about it, to stop that. Because it's very important for people to know, children and teenagers and people to know what is this history, because this history is the key to understand the present world. The present world. I mean, I'm not a Martiniquez, but I'm not sure there is Martiniquez in the. But let me tell you, we can wonder why. It seems to me that the chief of state in your country is still the Reine d'Angleterre, the Queen of Great Britain. And your countries and all the Caribbean countries belong to Commonwealth. Yes. That's at the 20th and 21st century, that's the trust, how do you say trust? Trust? Yes, trust of this history. And I don't think that stigmatizing a whole people is a way to escape of the traces of this history. So there are kind of links different between ex-metropole and ex-colonies, and that the way it is, it's a question of collective destiny. It's not a question of judgment. When I say it's very important for the government to be involved in this history, in teaching the history, not the content, but the teaching and searching and knowing more and more. It's because it's at the level of a state you may have the means to know exactly what it was. It was violence. Sure, it was violence. It was quite awful, horrific. But it was resistance. It was resilience. It was creativity. It was music. It was art. It was literature. It was singing. Joy and happiness and fighting and crying and laughing. It was all that. And we have to know it. We have to understand all that. We have to know all these people bring to the whole humanity, you know? Languages, new religions, new arts, and new music, jazz, blues, ragtime, soul, salsa, calypso, everything. We have to know that to understand what we bring. That's why we are invincible. But we have to know that. We have to share it. We have to give it to our children. So I can't do it myself. An association can't do it itself. We need the public means to know all this, to know how rich and how strong we are.
Okay.
I don't think we could have ended on a better place than this one. I want to thank the three panelists for being with us today. Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry.
I just wanted to ask another question also.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. You can take your seats. Thank you for that fantastic panel. All three of you, all four of you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. My name is Dan Carpenter, and I teach in the government department here at Harvard, and I direct the social sciences academic ventures faculty director at Radcliffe. And I want to offer, before giving some thanks, two reflections on today, one personal and one professional. I learned so much today. This isn't my field of study, primary, but what I learned about actually my own past and listening to stories about Georgetown and other places was a way of putting together parts of a larger story. I grew up in a small town, very small town of about 800 people in northern Michigan, entirely white. I then went to college at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. I then went to graduate school at the University of Chicago, the south side of Chicago. And then my three academic jobs have been at Princeton, which we heard a lot about yesterday, University of Michigan, and now, of course, Harvard. I learned today that every place along the way of my own academic journey was spent at an institution that supported me, housed me, educated me, credentialed me, and that owed its existence or its endowment or its buildings to slavery, and or which sat amidst but comfortably isolated from structures of racial oppression right in its neighborhood. Now, I had limited partial awareness of these stories before today. I knew some about Georgetown's history when I was there as a student. I knew a bit about Chicago's environment and what Ta-Nehisi Coates referred to as Rob Sampson's important research on racial segregation in Chicago. I knew something, many thanks to Sven Beckert, about the history of Harvard. But today gave me the opportunity to weave these threads together into a fabric which, like a wampum belt or maybe even a kente cloth, I could read. And what a sobering reading that is, to know that my entire educational career has been spent at a lineage of institutions supported, funded, subsidized, structured by slavery themselves. And that is one that I'm going to continue to read in the months and years and weeks to come, just as a person, as a student, as a scholar. And I hope that today's conference has given others the ability to read anew our past, individual and collective, our president and our universities and what they ought to do with their futures. I hope, as a professional remark, and second, that we can move, as Ta-Nehisi Coates said we should, to forms of reparation, and that we universities think more thoroughly and elaborately and specifically about what to do next. Let me say, as a political scientist, that I don't think that conversation about slavery in the university, either interrogating its past or discussing its future repair, can advance without consideration of the state. And here I'm so thankful that Madame Taubira just stole my point 10 minutes ago and said it far better than I'm about to convey it to you now. The state, by which I mean our government, our political, judicial, and administrative institutions, our laws. As the histories inform us, slavery prevailed and profited, in part because laws defined bodies of color as property, and the state enforced those laws and legitimated those bodies rendered as assets, expanding the geographies of slavery with armed force and with treaties and other strategies of Native American dispossession, structuring the contracts by which slaves were sold, including the Georgetown sale of 1838, and were executed and made enforceable. Enslavement was government, I think, maybe. Beyond the history, it seems difficult to think about repair, given the enormous weight of slavery and its legacies that Mr. Coates talked about in today's keynote, without considering the role of powers that can possibly bear some of that weight. Not just the resources, but the authority of our governments and their ability, like that of universities, to host and structure free dialogue must be brought to any repair effort. Now, exactly how that enlistment of the state occurs, of course, is something probably for another conference altogether, and I invite those far better equipped and more knowledgeable than I am to advance that discussion. I now want to turn to acknowledge the many people who made today happen. The Office of the President and Provost at Harvard made the decision to hold this conference, and they funded it and supported it. I want to thank President Drew Gilpin Faust and Provost Alan Garber for putting their enthusiasm and their commitment into this event. Thanks to both of you for your leadership. It's not a coincidence, I think, that this happened, this event, this committee, this searching examination of Harvard's history happened under the university presidency of an historian. And I know, and we all know, that President Faust has expressed a great concern and an interest in issues of racial justice for her entire life, going back to her childhood. So again, Drew, thank you. Dean Liz Cohen graciously and energetically took up the call from President Faust and Provost Garber and brought her training and perspective as herself a renowned historian of the United States to the event. And let me just say it is a privilege and an honor to work with her. Sven Beckert and Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, thank you so much for your hard work. You have changed the conversation at Harvard and the way that we think about ourselves, and it's an honor to have collaborated with you. Thanks for bringing a political scientist along for the ride. I greatly appreciate it. Radcliffe Institute, if I may say, having spent a number of years here, both as fellow, is really a wonder to behold, especially in its ability to host conferences. All of the speeches and conversations you saw today, and many of the things that you didn't and that I didn't, happened because this institute marshals such intense and passionate commitment from many people, from those who plan, those who cater, those who broadcast, those who wire the event, who clean up. These people are ably led by Rebecca Wasserman and her staff at Radcliffe Institute Academic Ventures, by Nisha Mongia and Chandra Manning in the Office of the Dean. Thank you also, Chandra, who served on the committee, by Jessica Vickland and her crew in events. And thanks to the many speakers and moderators who gave their time and talent to our event today. Finally, thanks to those of you who listened and entered into today's dialogue, who took the time to join us. The conversation we know will continue. Thank you.
It's been an incredible day. I think we've all been left with a lot to think about, and I hope conversations will only now begin, not end. But I think it's time to relax, to have some food and drink, and you've earned a reception. So please join us next door for one. Thanks again for coming, and I hope we'll see you again soon at the Institute.